editor view, we can move around in this by holding down Alt, left mouse button to orbit, middle mouse to move around, right mouse to move in and out. We can also use these icons up at the top of our editor windows to do the same thing. So just so we're able to move around here, but really we don't want to spend too much time talking about the interface. We want to jump right in and start making something. So one of the things that Cinema 4D does really, really well is work with splines. Those are basically just 2D line work kind of shapes, but we can use those to generate geometry. So let's begin by creating some simple spline primitives. We can hit the middle mouse to minimize and then maximize a particular view. So now we're in the top view. All right. Now let's bring in a spline. So you're going to find your splines right up here underneath this pin. If we click and hold on this, you can see in the blue there are all these different spline primitives. So ready-made shapes that we can bring in and use. So for our purposes, we're going to make some cool little Space Invader kind of alien shapes. And the important thing is that you get a kind of feel for combining these together. I don't necessarily want you to make what I'm making exactly. You can if you want to, but don't feel like you have to. But let's say we want to create some of these little aliens. So I'm going to start with a simple circle, and then let's bring in also a star. So we've got a circle and a star, and we can choose the circle, and you can see that the circle exists here in our object manager on the right hand side. This is kind of just a list of everything in our scene. Down below that we have attributes that we can modify. So we can change the radius, we can set certain things where it's got a middle like a donut. We can change the plane that it's being created along. So as this is a primitive right now, we're going to have all these attributes. Now we'll look at in a minute converting this to an editable spline, and that's going to change the attributes that we have here. Going to eliminate those. So let's say we want to create kind of an octopus sort of shape. So we'll take our star and we can kind of move it down to the bottom a little bit. And we can change the number of points if we want to, create something a little bit simpler. Or we can leave that at 8. I'm going to set mine to 8. And what we want to do now is create a combined spline for this, right? We don't want just the star and the circle. We want a spline that's sort of the outline. So we can use a generator to do this. So there are different kinds of generators to create geometry from splines. You can see here we have several, which we'll look at as we go through this. And jump in here, you can see there's one called spline mask. That's the one we want to use. So I'll grab that, and you can see it drops it into our object manager, but nothing's happening right now. In order for Cinema 4D to know what to do with this spline mask, we need to drop the splines that we want to use underneath this node here. So if we take our star and just click and drag it underneath, you can see the little arrow change. It's now parented under the spline mask, which is what we want. You can do this, take the star and do the same thing. Now both of these are parented under our spline mask, so we should be seeing a result here. This spline mask is working because we know, because this green check mark is on. If we want to turn off the effect of this, we can just hit that little green, and that goes to a red X, meaning that this isn't being taken into account. Let's turn that back on. Right now we're not getting exactly what we want, so what we want to do is change the axis. Now you can see the mode here, A union B. All that's doing is saying we want to take A and add it to B and just give us the outline. So we really have these Boolean operations that we can do based on the different splines here. So in this case, we want to add these together. So we'll do A union B, but we want to choose the axis that's pointing towards us as our axis here. So we want to choose XZ along Y, and you can see that creates our outline. Let's add another circle to the mix, and let's change the radius of this circle so it's a little bit smaller, and also move it down a bit. The transform tools are located right up here: move, scale, and rotate. You can see the shortcuts for those as well, E, T, and R. So I'm just going to translate this down, and I can change this radius, take it down a bit. Now if I want to take this spline mask, the resulting spline, and bake it down into just a regular spline, I can do that by either right-clicking and say Make Editable, or there's also a Make Editable button over here. And that works with all the primitives as well. So now we've taken away that node, we've taken away the original splines, and now we're left with just this spline that creates that shape. Now if we'd like to combine this spline with another, in this case this circle, let's make that circle editable. So now we have two basic splines. We can select both of these, right-click, and let's say Connect Objects and Delete. That'll connect those into one single spline and get rid of the originals. we can go ahead and call this something like Invader 1. And that is one example. Now these are completely flat here. You can see here that it's lying completely flat on the floor. So it's kind of just a 2D flat shape. Okay, now if you want to draw those in different angles, or if you want to rotate this to face the front, we can select our object, go to rotate. We can begin to rotate this, and you can see right here in the heading, pitch, and bank, this is set to 8, so I'm just going to set that to 90 degrees, and now it's facing us, and we can rotate that. So the next one, maybe we want to draw in the front view so it matches up. So to turn off the visibility of this one, we can use these little stoplights. So right now they're gray, meaning it's sort of default. If we hit green, that means show it in the editor or show it in the render. Now these don't really render, so it doesn't really mean much, but if I want to turn off the visibility, I can hit the red. Okay, so that means it's still there in our scene, we just can't see it in our view. Okay, so that's one. We can start with different things. Let's start with, I'm going to start with just like a cogwheel. I can change the inner radius, I can change the middle radius, make those kind of a little bit more squared off. I can change the number of teeth. So we take that down to 9. I'm going to bring in just a rectangle. And again, just reiterate that you don't have to do exactly the same thing that I'm doing. You can do something a little bit different. Bring in your own, the splines that you want to sort of bring in here. And kind of bring in a kind of a squared off shape. Let me reduce that rectangle's height. So maybe something like that. And we can start to do these in different layers. So we can start to, let's say, build this out. So we use a spline mask with the rectangle and the cogwheel. That spline mask is going along the Z in this case because we've now drawn it out in the front view. So keep in mind what axis it is that you need. So we can say, okay, that's good for part of it. So then we'll take this, make it editable, and now we can use this with another spline. So let's take another rectangle here, and we'll move this one down a little bit, size it kind of appropriately. And this time, we'll create now another spline mask, and we'll dump our result into our spline mask along with this new rectangle. Now let's change the mode. So instead of A union B, let's do A subtract B. And then we can cut part of it out. Okay, we can take our rectangle and maybe move it down a little bit if we want to. And then we can take the result of that, make that editable. So it's just a kind of a process of going through and adding different things. We can create now, let's create an inside here. So you can kind of bring this in. You can see, you can start to change the number of sides that we have here, change our radius a little bit. Let's make it a little bit smaller. And sort of move it in like that. And again, get another spline mask. Bring these two guys together. And then make the result editable. Let's do one more on this. Let's grab this four-sided, bring it up. Let's kind of increase the width, decrease the height. And this time, we'll just make that spline editable, and we'll take both of these, connect and delete. We're not actually subtracting or adding to anything. So, there's another one. Let's turn the visibility off on that one. Let's do maybe a couple more quick ones here. Let's start with this four-sided diamond shape, and we'll kind of make it a bit wider. We can now add a rectangle. Let's make the rectangle a bit narrower. So something like that. And let's kind of move this down a little bit. We'll make it a bit higher. Okay, and holding down Control and moving it will create a copy. So we'll create a copy all the way over here. Okay, and then we can take both of these, make those editable, connect and delete, and now we'll use our spline mask with these rectangles and this four-sided piece, and then we'll make the result editable. And then we can continue on by sort of cutting part of this out. So grab another rectangle, and starting to see how quickly you can get some really kind of cool results just with some very simple shapes that you can make in Cinema 4D. Let's make this width a bit more, and we'll use both sides at the same time. So now again, spline mask. And you just have to know what sort of operation you're doing. So now you want to go into your spline mask and you want to subtract to cut out those edges. Make editable. And so you can start to get something like that. Now let's make the little feet coming across here real quickly. So I'll just make a little square shape. Kind of something like that. And then I'll do the same thing over here. Now we could do these separately, okay, or we could, again, take both of those and then just connect them before. So all we're really doing is just making this into one spline so we can do this operation at one time instead of doing it multiple times. And then bring both of those in. And this is going to be a union along the Z. Make editable. Okay, so that's kind of cool. Let's do another one. So there's all kinds of different splines that you can create in here. We can take our rectangle here, and let's take a few circles. So I'm going to add a circle kind of up at the top. Let's control drag this down to the side and down here as well. I'm going to move this off just a bit, and I'll take both of these, make them editable and connect them and delete. Let's take our spline mask and drop the original circle and the rectangle in there, and then we'll make that editable. Another spline mask, drop that in, and then drop those two circles in there. Make something like that, make that editable. Then let's take our sort of diamond shape. Let's cut part out of the top. So we've got this shape. What will we do? We'll take a spline mask, take our overall, drop it underneath, and our diamond shape. And it looks like a recent graduate. But we want to, instead of making a union, we'll go A, subtract B, and that'll kind of cut that out. And then we can come in and we can cut out different sections here as well and create interesting shapes. So have a little fun with it. Make maybe 4 or 5 variations just using some of the different splines that you see in here. Don't even worry about drawing out those splines, although you can experiment with that too. But you can just come in and start to use some of these primitive splines. Now in the next lesson, we will look at how we can use a generator to add some thickness to our splines. So once we've got our images, just spline shapes. Okay, so let's take our splines. I've turned them all and made them all visible, and let's just kind of make them around the same size so they take up roughly the same space. So we can do that by selecting each one of these. We can use our different transform tools to move them and scale them. Another thing that we will do is I'm going to go ahead and take all these, and you can see we have basic coordinate object in our attributes now. We'll go to coordinate, and I'm just going to freeze all on all of those, and that's just going to zero out our coordinates if we happen to have moved those or scaled those anywhere. Next, I'll take each one of these, and I want to move the center of each one of these to the actual center of the bounding box. So let's go to Mesh, Axis Center, and we'll center Axis 2. You can see it moved it down a little bit on that one. Here, let's do the same thing. Center Axis 2, so it's centering our axis. And let's do the same thing here. And then we'll center this axis as well. Right now you can see it's just at the center of that circle. I moved it up a little bit. Okay, so now let's turn off all but one of these. So maybe use this one as our example. what we'd like to do now is make this into a piece of geometry. So give it some thickness, maybe some rounded edges. We can do that using a generator. So this one is going to be located right up here where you can see subdivision surface. If we click and hold, you can see there's lathe, sweep, Bezier, loft, and extrude. So these will all work with splines here. These will. And then we can go ahead and create different types of geometry from those splines. So in this case, we want to create sort of a stamped flat piece of geometry, so we're going to use extrude. Now, if you remember, the way that we get these to work is we take the spline that we want to use, we parent it underneath. So let's take the spline and parent it underneath the extrude. Now, if we select the extrude, we can go to Object, and you can see there are, along the movement, there's 3 values here. There are 3 values, 0, 0, and 20. These correspond to the different axes, okay? So the X, Y, and Z. So right now, we're getting some thickness going in this direction. That's because we have the 20 centimeters here in the Z. So if we zero that out, you can see it's just a flat plane, no thickness. If we were to create some movement in the X, you can see it's going along the X direction, which in this case doesn't make much sense. We don't want to do that. We can also do it in the Y, up and down. So for our case, and it will change depending on how your spline is oriented. If it's oriented along the X, then you're going to want to add your movement along the X. But for us, we want to create some thickness along the Z. Now you can see how it treats this spline. So this is a nice closed spline all the way around the outside, so you don't want to have an open spline for this. Even though we do have a hole in the middle, it does have an area in here that makes sense for creating geometry. Okay, there's no openings in here, everything is enclosed, and it makes sense. You could put other holes in here too, and it would take those into account. You can see I can turn the effect of the extrude on or off. Now the extrude is creating this geometry right in here, and the geometry on the front and on the back, those are the caps. So if we come into the caps section here, you can see the start and end are set to cap. If we choose to set those to none, we just get the thickness, get kind of a cookie cutter. So we want to set those to cap. And you can see with those caps on, we get a really, really sharp edge. Now we may not want that. We may want an edge that is a little bit softer. Well, we can manipulate that edge by changing our caps from caps to fillet cap. We can do the same thing down here. Now, there's only one step, so you can see we're just getting one single bevel, which might be what you want. But you can also increase the steps to make more of a curved corner. We can do the same thing on the back. You can also increase the size of the radius or decrease it. So make a larger soft edge or a smaller one. You can see it also affects the inside of our circle here. So let's just set this to maybe something like 8. And I just want to make it even on both sides. Now there are also different types of fillets. So if you don't want just a rounded corner like that, that's the convex type. You can also set it to linear, so it would be kind of a straight bevel. We could make it concave, which would be sort of an inset there. You can kind of see that. It looks similar from this angle, but up here you can kind of see where it's inset. We could also do like a half circle, which would give you kind of a lip that sticks up. So there's a lot that we can do here just with this simple generator. So I'm going to set this back to convex to make a nice rounded corner there. And then we can always go back to object and we can change the depth by changing the movement. So once we get the settings like we want, one thing we could do would just be to control drag this extrude, delete that, and put the new one inside. Okay, do the same thing here. Delete that, put the spline inside that. That way we don't have to set all those values. Okay, all the values have been carried over, so they should all be the same. Now we can turn this one off, and we can see the other ones there. So here's the one shape. There's that one. Can turn that off. There's the other one. And all the edges have the same settings, the same attributes. All right, so that's how we can really quickly add some thickness to our little shapes that we've created using an extrude object. If you want to experiment with the lathe, that'll kind of revolve it around a particular axis, or a sweep will take geometry along another, take a spline along another spline. Think of that like a tube. And then extrude will allow us to create these nice little stamped shapes. This is good for text as well. If you want to create 3D text, just type that out with text, and then you can add the extrude to add the thickness. So in the next lesson, let's take a look at one of Cinema 4D's powerful tools, a cloner object. That'll allow us to create a bunch of different objects and have a lot of control over how those are laid out, and then also have some control over the animation and movement of those. Depending on the version, the bundle that you have, there is a MoGraph section up here on the menu. And one of the things inside of MoGraph is a cloner. That's kind of one of the basic building blocks of this. And really these tools are meant to help in the creation of broadcast, 3D text, fly-throughs, animation, things like that. You can do multiple objects and manipulate those in different ways to get some really cool broadcast kind of effects. And so that's one of the uses for those, but it's a really powerful tool here in Cinema 4D, and I wanted to check it out. So let's go to MoGraph and let's create a cloner object. And just like with these, the cloner works with objects that are parented underneath it. So I've got just this first object here, and I'll go ahead and close those up. The first one's visible, everything else is turned off for now. So what I want to do is just drop this extrude underneath the cloner. Now you can see something's happened here. It looks a little bit odd. What's really going on is there are now multiple copies of this extrude. So if we click on the cloner and we go to Object, you'll see there are a number of attributes that we can change here. Now the number of objects that we're seeing right now is 3. Okay, and the amount of space between is set to 50. So if I increase that, you can see I can spread those out. There's also a handle here that we can use to manipulate those. So I can kind of bring this down a little bit. I can move it, and you can see that's moving all 3 of those values. I can take it down, close to the original there, and then we can sort of move them up. So let's zero that out in the X and the Z. You can see it sort of makes a straight line. We can also increase the count. So I can take the count up, and you can see they just keep copying up along that line. So that's because the mode is set right now to linear. So it's basically making a line out of these copies. We can also go into transform, and we can begin to rotate these and create some really cool sort of looks here. It kind of speeds things up and lets us deal with these all as one piece, or all at one time rather. Now there are different modes here. We can change this from linear, and let's say we want to make a grid. We'll change it to a grid array, and now we have 3 different counts and 3 different sizes. So you can see we have all of our little handles here. We can grab those handles and start to pull them out. So let's kind of pull it out so they're spaced out a little bit. You can see we have now a 3x3 grid. And if we pull it out this way, you can see 3x3x3. So in our case, let's say that we don't necessarily want to have all of the ones in the back. Okay, and so we can take the count down in one of these axes, so that gives us kind of a flat grid. And maybe we want to increase the amount, so maybe there's 20. Maybe it's 20 by 20. Now the spacing needs to be increased because we have all of those copies in there. So we need to pull those out, and then we need to pull those out in this direction as well. Maybe that's a little bit too many. So let's do maybe 12 by 12. And there you can see the spacing. You can modify the spacing again by changing the handles, or you can change the size in here. Let's take this down a little bit so we just get kind of a grid. And so here you can see we have a nice grid of our little objects. Now at any time we can come in and change the object attributes. So I could come into the extrude that's underneath the cloner, and I could increase the thickness of it, or the movement rather. And you can see that that's increasing. Now what happens if I want to include more than just this one example? So let's turn the rest of them on and let's drop them all inside the cloner. Let's start with just the first one. So now we've got two different objects inside of our cloner. You can see what's going on. It's basically alternating between them. So going one after the other. We go into our cloner, you can see that it's set to iterate. If we drop in the other one underneath, and finally the last one, and let's kind of reorder those. So now it's doing the same order all the way across. Let's space this out a little bit more because now we have two things that are different sizes. Let me select the cloner, select our handle here. So you can see we're getting the exact same order. What if we want to randomize it a little bit? Well, we can go into clones. Instead of iterate, let's choose random. And that will place these different alien invader shapes randomly within our cloner. So there's not going to be kind of a set pattern. Makes them a little bit more random. And then we still have the ability to change the count. We can change and make it a complete 3D grid. Okay, we can go into transform and we can still kind of rotate those if we need to. But it's now going in randomly picking any of the objects that are underneath that cloner and placing those appropriately. So cloners are going to be a really powerful way to create some really interesting effects using geometry that you can just drop underneath, and you still have the flexibility to change it as well. So one of the cool things about using a cloner is the fact that we can use different kinds of effectors to make things appear, make them turn around, make them come into the frame. So let's take a look in the next lesson at